Colleagues, I'm going to get started now with our session. So please take your seats. I want to begin this session with a warm welcome to you who've come and to think about climate change with us today, and to think about climate change this weekend at the American Academy of Religion. I want to also say I have a confession, which is up until this last year or so, I, like most people in the AAR, didn't think a lot about climate change as a crisis, as an important part of my scholarly research. And I called this meeting and chose this theme largely because I didn't know enough and wanted to know if we really did serious research for a year and focused our attention on this problem, we could come up with some creative solutions. A few hours ago, we saw the PRRI's report that really investigated what our colleagues in faith communities across the United States thought about climate change. It's a sobering report. I urge you all to read it. And for this session, we have something remarkable, which is the most important single voice in climate change science coming to speak to us, and that is the UN International Committee on Global Climate Change, the UN Ipcc. It received the Nobel Prize, and it is the first of the two Nobel Prize winners that are going to come and speak to us this session in San Diego. And it's remarkable because this is the largest global coalition of science and economics and sociologists. These experts have worked on this project for decades to come to an overwhelming consensus on climate change theory. And we have, about a year ago, I asked the committee if they could send us a few people to talk, and who responded was the head of the entire organization and a critically important scientist. It is remarkable that they have responded so vividly. It is because of the centrality of religion in this discussion, and I urge you to give them their closest attention. This is a time that is remarkable for the AAR. Our first speaker is Dr. Rajendra Pachauri. On 20th of November 2002, Dr. Pachauri was elected chairman of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN panel established by the World Meteorological Organization and the UN's Environment Program, to assess information relevant for understanding climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007 during his tenure, and he accepted it. He was also been the Director General of TERI, a research and policy organization in India, and Chancellor of the Tari University, besides being the chairman of the Governing Council of the Board of Columbia, of the Agro Foundation, as well as the chairman of the board of Columbia University's International Research Institute for Climate and Society. Dr. Pachauri has been outspoken about climate change. He has been appointed as the senior advisor to the Yale Climate and Energy Institute from July 2012, prior to which he was the founding director of YCEI since July 2009. In his acceptance speech for the Nobel Peace Prize, he emphasized his concern for the poor as the most proximate victims of climate change, saying, "We have raised the threat of dramatic population migration and conflict and war over water and other resources, as well as a realignment of power among nations. Some also highlight the possibility of rising tensions between rich and poor nations, health problems caused particularly by water shortages and crop failures," always bringing our attention, drawing our attention to the connection between poverty, social injustice, and climate change. He's conceptualized and launched Lighting a Billion Lives, an initiative in 2005 to bring electricity to energy-starved rural areas of India through solar energy. And this initiative has taken solar energy to such remote places like the Sundarbans, West Bengal, and the Thar Desert. He is the recipient of so many awards, it's too long to name them all here, and has long been a central voice among the leading voices for attention to the urgent problem of climate change. I welcome him here, and I am enormously proud to welcome him to the AAR. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zoloth, Dr. Puckett, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Let me at the outset apologize for not being there present physically, but I'm very grateful that technology has made it possible for me to say a few words to you, which I'm sure will be elaborated on and added on by my very distinguished colleague, Dr. Chris Field, who is co-chair of Working Group 2 of the IPCC. I think the significance of theology and religion is enormous. Science can provide the knowledge, can provide the scientific assessment and base on which action can be built. But clearly, action has to be driven by far more than just knowledge and science. It has to be driven essentially by human behavior, which emanates from an adherence to specific theologies and religions. As it happens, all the religions of the world tell us a few things that are common across every religion in the world. I would like to emphasize three aspects of climate change, which I think are important in determining what needs to be done and how and when we should start doing things to meet this great challenge. Firstly, what are the implications of climate change for the creation, which supports life, life that all of us treasure and all of us are gifted with? The second is, what are the implications for this generation? And we now have a lot of observations. We have a substantial amount of evidence of what human actions have been doing to the climate of this planet, which has implications not 10, 20, 30 years down the road, but today, all around us. And I would like to mention a third dimension, which is what are the implications for coming generations? Let me first say that Einstein was right when he said problems cannot be solved at the level of awareness that created them. Today, we have awareness, we have knowledge, and I'm particularly grateful that the leaders of theology and religion and those who are going to teach these subjects are present in this audience today. Let me talk about what we are doing to our creation. Well, climate change has led to melting of bodies of ice across the globe. It has led to an increase in the intensity and frequency of extreme events, which is something that my colleague Dr. Chris Field will tell you much more about. We have led to acidification of the ocean and increase in the heat that is absorbed by the ocean. Let me just give you two numbers. 30% of the carbon dioxide that's been emitted since the beginning of industrialization has gone into the oceans, and that has led to acidification, which has very serious implications for marine life, for marine ecosystems, and directly or indirectly on human existence as well. The other fact that I'd like to mention about the oceans is the fact that between 1971 and 2010, 90% of the heat that's been generated associated with climate change has gone into the oceans. And warming of the oceans has now gone down to 700 meters and is sinking gradually lower and lower. That also has very serious implications for marine life and marine ecosystems. We have certainly been responsible for large-scale deforestation in several parts of the world, and that clearly has not only implications for the health and conservation of forests, but also the rich biodiversity. And as it happens, most of the deforestation is taking place in regions which have the highest density of biodiversity. Now, all of this has major implications for what we are leaving behind on this planet for generations yet to come, and I'll say a little more about that. But let me see what all of this means in terms of intra-generational equity, what all of this means to the ethical and equitable dimensions of climate change as far as the current generation is concerned. Well, firstly, we must remember that climate change really leaves those who are most vulnerable exposed to the highest risks. And again, this is something that Dr. Chris Field will say much more about. And in a sense, there's a very important ethical aspect of this problem because those communities which are the most vulnerable, in most cases, are the least responsible for having caused the problem. If you look at some of the small island states which are being threatened by sea level rise, clearly they have contributed hardly anything to the emissions of greenhouse gases in the past and therefore have not really contributed to the concentration of greenhouse gases, which is the result of which is resulting in human-induced climate change. Um, if I may give you a figure, the increase in average global temperature since the beginning of the last century right through to 2010 has been 0.85 degrees Celsius. If you convert that to Fahrenheit numbers, I think that works out to close to about 1.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And sea level rise has been 19 centimeters. Now that's pretty close to a foot. So you can imagine low-lying areas are clearly very concerned about the sea level rise which has already taken place and the actions that we are responsible for, which would result in higher levels of sea level rise in the future. There are also impacts on human health. And I might mention that the the three last decades, have successively been warmer than the previous ones and have likely been the warmest 3 decades since 1850. So we are on a trend that clearly is something that has to be reversed. As a matter of fact, if we look at the increase in greenhouse gas emissions, then in the year 2010, human beings were responsible for greenhouse gas emissions of 49 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. This, incidentally, was a figure which registered at 39 gigatons in the year 2000. So, in the short space of 10 years, we have substantially increased the emissions of greenhouse gases. And that has not only implications for the current generation, but also generations yet to come. And here, may I say that we need to consider the whole issue of intergenerational equity because if we were to assess what this means for the ability of future generations to be able to develop, to be able to meet their own needs, then surely we are leaving a planet that essentially would make it very, very challenging and would impose huge risks on generations yet to come. Now, the IPCC in the fifth assessment report has assessed four different scenarios of increase in greenhouse gas emissions. The lowest one is the scenario that essentially gives us a high level of hope in being able to limit temperature increase by the end of this century to 2 degrees Celsius or less. The highest scenario is one in which there is no additional mitigation, and that clearly is going to lead to a very rapid increase in emissions of greenhouse gases and therefore growing concentration of these gases in the atmosphere. Now, in that scenario, what I might call the do nothing scenario, we might end up with an increase in temperature by the end of the century of 4.8 degrees Celsius. And that, I'm afraid, really spells very grave risks for all living species on this planet. And sea level rise associated with that particular scenario could be as high as 0.98 meters. So that's more than 3 feet actually. And you can imagine there are several parts of the world, including those in the United States, which would clearly be threatened by that level of increase in the sea, in the height of the sea. There would also be an increase in pockets of poverty. There's the possibility of our being responsible for adding to the drivers of conflict. There would be greater displacement of people. And one important fact that I might mention is in this sort of do nothing scenario, we find that there's a likelihood by the middle of this century, in September, we would observe no sea ice in the Arctic. In other words, the Arctic Ocean could very well be free of sea ice in the month of September, which is the period when you have the lowest level of ice with the melting during the summer. So this is the kind of specter that we have of what we are leaving to coming generations. And therefore, it is essential for us to act. And what do we do in order to act? Well, firstly, we have to adapt to the impacts of climate change. There is a certain inertia in the system as a result of past emissions and increases in concentration of greenhouse gases. We have no choice but to confront a certain level of climate change for which we would have to come up with adaptation measures. And these have to be taken in hand urgently. These would require some institutional changes, some simple measures, and possibly some investments as well. So the needs for adaptation need to be assessed quickly, and we need to implement these measures effectively across the globe, depending on the specific impacts that every location and region is going to face. Uh, but adaptation alone will not see us through this challenge. We would obviously reach certain tipping points and thresholds beyond which adaptation would become extremely challenging. And therefore, it's essential that simultaneously we start mitigating the emissions of greenhouse gases. And this has to be done on a global basis because we're dealing with gases that mix freely across the globe. And therefore, the effort to reduce emissions has to be a global effort. Let me say that the scenario which gives us the highest assurance of temperature increase by the end of the century, less than 2 degrees Celsius, is the one that would need to would need to end with zero emissions by the end of the century, or in fact negative emissions. Now this can be done because we have clearly estimated that it would be difficult, particularly if we delay action, but it's something that is available to us through a range of options that we can implement. So we need to take steps by which we start mitigating the emissions of greenhouse gases very rapidly. And this, of course, is not going to be easy simply because we're sort of on a roller coaster. We are increasing emissions at a rate where not only do we have to halt them, not only do we have to halt deforestation, but we need to really bring about a reversal. However, if we delay taking action as far as mitigation is concerned, then the costs are going to become much, much higher over time. And some of the technologies that would be required to reduce emissions effectively would possibly not even be available. So this is something we have to keep in mind. In essence, what we need to do is to start taking action as early as possible because that's the only way and that's the only ethical basis for us to ensure that we maintain reasonably good health of the creation, which already, may I say, is affected quite seriously by the impacts of climate change, by which we ensure that people across the globe have an opportunity to pull themselves out of poverty, to lead healthy and respectable lives, and that we ensure that coming generations are not affected in a manner that would make it very difficult for them to continue with a level of secure, stable, and peaceful existence. I'll end by mentioning that the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change has as its central core an article which is called Article 2. And that I'll read out, I'll quote from the convention. It says, the ultimate objective of the convention is stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic, that means human-induced interference with the climate system. Such a level should be achieved within a time frame sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally to climate change, to ensure that food production is not threatened, and to enable economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. So in a sense, this covers the three dimensions of the problem that I've tried to place before you and the solutions that are required. Now, science cannot tell us what is dangerous, but I want to mention a few facts that would hopefully provide a basis for us to take adequate and timely action to deal with this challenge of climate change. Firstly, let me say that more intense and more frequent extreme precipitation events are very likely over many regions. Two types of extreme events, and this is something that Dr. Crisfield will tell you much more about, that we need to be worried about and that confront us is an increase in the frequency and intensity of heat waves, the length of heat waves, and also the frequency and intensity of extreme precipitation events. And as I mentioned, it's likely that the Arctic Ocean will become nearly ice-free in September before mid-century, based on this highest level scenario of emissions where there's no additional mitigation action. I might also point out that a 2-degree increase in temperature is still going to leave us with some very serious challenges. For instance, it's very likely that global sea level rise will continue in the 21st century. And according to the lowest scenario, which we think is the most favored scenario in terms of keeping temperature increased to 2 degrees by the end of the century, will still result in sea level rise of anywhere from 0.26 meters to 0.55 meters. So, in other words, that's still going to pose some major challenges to several parts of the globe. There are projections of reductions in renewable surface water and groundwater resources in some regions, and projections of increasing displacement of people and risks of violent conflicts, and the risk associated with crossing certain thresholds increases with rising temperatures. So if we really want to implement the convention, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which incidentally is in the process of being discussed in the forthcoming Conference of the Parties in Lima, Peru, and then next year in the next Conference of the Parties in Paris. We obviously have to keep in mind the scientific facts that have been brought out by the IPCC on what is a do nothing uh, scenario versus a scenario by which we can really contain this problem in a manner that minimizes the risks and minimizes some of the ethical negative aspects of climate change. So I'd just like to say that uh, what we need is an acceptance by the community that's involved in theology and religion to realize that the fact we have enough scientific evidence clearly requires us to look at the ethical and equitable dimensions of climate change and some of the actions that would be required. I'll just end by saying that if we were to move on a pathway of stringent mitigation, then we have assessed that the cost to the global economy would be 0.06% of global consumption on an annual basis. So we need to ask ourselves, is that too high a price to pay for avoiding some of the worst impacts of climate change? And what's even more important is the fact that some of the actions required to mitigate emissions of greenhouse gases also lead to a substantial amount of co-benefits. These would be in the nature of higher energy security, lower levels of air pollution at the local level, certainly the possibility of greater employment, also agricultural yields, which are likely to be affected adversely as a result of climate change, could then be stabilized, so we would not be compromising on food security across the globe. Uh, Please do visit the website of the IPCC, where you can read the summary for policymakers of the synthesis report, and that will give you a snapshot of what we are doing to this planet in terms of climate change and what needs to be done to deal with it. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm very grateful for this moment when I can speak to such a distinguished audience, and I hope what I've said may have some relevance to what you're going to be teaching, what you're going to be telling others, because we really need to do this all together. Mahatma Gandhi rightly said, be the change you want to see in the world. So each one of us has to be the change that we want to see in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's even more remarkable when you consider what time it is in India, in Delhi, where he's speaking. We thought because of the time constraints that we would allow you to ask questions now, Dr. Pachauri, and before I introduce our next speaker. So if you have any questions, please come to the microphones on either side. Anyone? Okay, I guess this was a clear statement. I believe strongly, as an ethicist, that good religion and good ethics needs to start with good science. And because of that, we thought we'd have this session in which we would begin with the facts as agreed upon by the best scientists in the world who've spent 34 years thinking about this issue. One of the best of that group is also Dr. Chris Field. Dr. Field, who will speak to us now, is the founding director of the Carnegie Institution's Department of Global Ecology and the Melvin and Joan Lane Professor for Interdisciplinary Environmental Studies at Stanford University. Field's research emphasizes field and laboratory studies of impacts of climate change, from the molecular to the global scale. He is the co-chair of Working Group 2 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which led the effort on the IPCC special report on managing the risks of extreme events and disasters to advance climate change adaptation in 2012, and Working Group 2's contribution to the IPCC fifth assessment report just coming out this month. This came out this month in 2014. Field's research has been recognized with several American and international awards, including the Max Planck Research Award and the Roger Revelle Medal, with election to learned societies, including the U.S. National Academy of Sciences in 2001. Field has received his PhD from Stanford in 1981 and has been at the Carnegie Institute for Science since 1984, and we welcome here to the American Academy of Religion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Laurie, and thanks to all of you for coming to a session that's about a topic that might seem kind of distant and remote. But let me start with three numbers just to make the case that it's not all that distant or remote. The first is that 2014 is on track to be the warmest year in the instrumental record, probably the warmest year in the last couple thousand. We've been discussing climate change for a long time, but we're really not making as much progress as we need to. In 2013, we saw the largest increase in atmospheric CO2 since we began measuring, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. But it's also true that not all the news is bad. Just this month, there was the announcement of a really bold new agreement between the United States and China for both countries to take on ambitious efforts to cut their CO2 emissions. And even though the specific commitments that were made by the US and China didn't go all the way to solving the problem, I think there's a real potential that those will be catalytic in generating the kinds of conversations and the kinds of decisions that are going to be eventually relevant to the kind of solution that will really be comprehensive. What I'd like to do in my comments today is really just kind of fill in the overall picture that Dr. Pachauri so eloquently painted, is especially eloquent given the fact that it's, I think, just about 2 o'clock in the morning in Delhi where he's speaking from. The IPCC is a really unique partnership between the world's governments and the scientific community. We don't have anything else like it in science or anywhere else in society. I want to say just a couple of things about the way the institution works so that you have a sense of the value that comes from its assessments. Essentially, the way it works is the world's governments said to the scientific community, well, scientific community, if you'll follow our rules, we'll consider your assessments to be the definitive statements of what we know and what we don't know about the science of climate change. And they worked out a set of rules that essentially harvest the dedication and wisdom of the entire scientific community to provide really clear statements of where the community is, respecting the distribution of expertise. And we often think about trying to characterize the scientific position in terms of things like opinion surveys, but those opinion surveys are a really shallow reflection of the depth of the analysis that goes into the IPCC reports. One of the things that's remarkable about the IPCC reports, they don't necessarily say that the problem's solved. They highlight the aspects that we don't know. They highlight the full range of scientific opinions on important topics. And most important, they indicate what kinds of research have stood the test of time and what kinds of conclusions we should really have confidence in. Let me turn now to the findings of the IPCC, and I want to begin by repeating three elements of the assessment where it's really critical that values structure the final decisions that are made. And Dr. Pachauri characterized it really eloquently when he quoted from Article 2 of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which says the goal of this convention is to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. There's no question that climate change is already dangerous if you were in the path of a hurricane that was caused by climate change, or if you lost your home as a result of a river flood. But there's a sense in which the world needs to deal with the concept of danger at an appropriate scale. And let me mention three elements of value that really underscore the elements of what it means to be dangerous. So the first is the question of what's the relative valuations on the well-being of the aggregate versus the well-being of the poorest? What's the unfairness component of climate change? The second is what's the valuation of economic activity by humans versus non-monetary aspects of the environment, biodiversity, aesthetic values, things that are widely regarded as important but difficult to capture in standard monetary analysis. And then third, probably the most challenging aspect of coming up with an effective evaluation of what dangerous anthropogenic interference would mean is understanding the emphasis that should be put on interests of the present generation versus interests of future generations. One of the things that really came out to me clearly in the most recent assessment of the IPCC is that at least the first two of those value issues don't play out to be very important. I mean, they're critically important in the big picture, but the emphasis is so strongly aligned between both sets of interests that it's not really clear that you would make any different decisions. If you look at the interests of the rich versus the poor, both are highly vulnerable. If you look at impacts on things that are easy to monetize and things that are difficult to monetize, both are highly vulnerable. So the real challenge that we need to think about is this question of interests of the present versus interests of the future. And I want to set up the discussion about that in the context of a dichotomy that's often used, and I want to conclude with a couple of remarks about why it's a false dichotomy. And it brings me back basically to the same point that Dr. Pachauri ended his comments. And essentially, the dichotomy that's often laid out now is if we're really interested in the well-being of the poorest among us, if we're interested in the well-being of the future, are we better off investing in economic growth, the most rapid possible economic growth, or are we better off investing in protecting the climate so that there's a window of sustainability? And I think the conclusion from the most recent round of IPCC reports is really, really important, and that's a false dichotomy because the best investments preserve both opportunities for sustainable economic development and for a sustainable climate. Let me make just a couple of comments about where we are in our understanding of climate impacts. The first is that there's often a narrative that climate change is something about the future, or it's something about impacts that are being experienced somewhere other than where you live or I live. And that's incorrect. We now live in a world where we've seen clear, in the scientific community we call them attributed, impacts of climate change on every continent across the oceans. We've seen impacts from the equators to the poles and from the coasts to the mountains. We've seen impacts on almost every sector. We've seen impacts on physical systems, things like when rivers flow, how much water they carry. We've seen impacts on biological systems, wildfires, when plants and animals are active, what their ranges are. And we've seen impacts on human systems, and I'll talk a little bit more about those. And they range from things like impacts on agriculture to impacts on conflict. Let me give you an example of the kinds of impacts we've seen, and agriculture is a good case because progress in increasing ag yields, of course, been one of the real triumphs of the human enterprise over the last half century or so, with yields of the major food crops all increasing by 1 or 2% per year. But we now know that it's getting to be more and more difficult to increase yields of the world's major food crops, and we've seen the biggest impacts on wheat and corn, such that in the last several decades, the climate changes that have already occurred have scrubbed about 2% per decade off of yield increases in wheat and about 1% per decade off of yield increases in corn. Essentially, no question that impacts have occurred around the world, and that everybody is potentially in harm's way. It's also increasingly clear that vulnerability is distributed around the world. Dr. Pachauri talked about the special challenges of vulnerability of the poorest among us. There's no question that lack of resources, weak institutions, poor governance make it incredibly difficult to deal with the challenges of climate change. But that doesn't mean that it's the most vulnerable or the only people or ecosystems at risk. And with, for example, Hurricane Sandy in the northeast of the U.S. in 2012, what we saw is that in one of the richest cities in the world, there's tremendous damage from what was actually a very modest scale of hurricane. In fact, there was a debate about whether even to call it a hurricane. It shows that we're not prepared anywhere. And when we think about vulnerability, let me characterize the climate challenge in a different way than you may have heard about. You know, one of the things that's been most difficult in terms of thinking about effective action on climate change is, well, how much do we need to know in order to take action? Do we need to know everything about climate change? Do we know what kinds of impacts were here in my backyard in which year? And in fact, if you really look at climate change in the sweep of the kinds of issues we encounter, you see that instead of an issue where one additional science fact, one additional observation is going to make the difference, it's really a challenge in managing risks. And risks from climate change impacts really emerge from 3 different kinds of domains. One is the physical triggers from the climate system, and we know a ton about those. We also know they're changing. The second is vulnerability, and we know that vulnerability is caused by a wide range of social and economic conditions, and we know that vulnerability can either be improved or it can be degraded as societies advance. And the third is exposure. You know, what are the assets at risk? And economic and social development can either increase exposure or it can decrease it. By understanding that climate change is a challenge in managing risk, and that risks emerge from essentially the overlap between the triggers from the climate system, vulnerability, and exposure, really understand the dimensions of the problem space. But as I'll turn to in a couple of minutes, you also understand the dimensions of the possible solutions. There are a number of advantages about thinking about climate change as a challenge in managing risk. The first is that it connects climate challenges we'll face in the future with challenges we face now. We know we're not prepared for the climate challenges we face now. Second, it points out that most of the issues with a changing climate are issues with extremes of drought, high temperatures, wildfire, rising sea level, that in essence, extremes are kind of the sharp end of the climate stick, and being at the wrong place and the wrong time is a critical component of sensitivity to extremes. A third reason it's important to think about climate as a challenge in managing risks is that there are many things we don't know about what the climate of the future is going to be. And if we want to be prepared, we need to be prepared for the full range of possible outcomes. In the climate science community, we put a lot of effort into understanding the most likely outcomes of climate in coming decades. But it's also important to recognize that we should be prepared for low probability but much higher consequence outcomes in case we don't exactly have it right. Fourth, it's important to recognize that society, we have a wide range of tools for managing risks, and those tools range from decisions that get made at the scale of individual families, and decisions about buying insurance or buying a vehicle with anti-lock brakes or airbags, all the way to the scale of governments, which make decisions about managing risks when they look at long-term infrastructure or investments in national security. So we have a wide range of tools available. And then finally, it's useful to understand climate as a challenge in managing risk, because most of the impacts of climate change don't occur in the absence of all the other stresses that we face. In general, most of the impacts of climate change have occurred and will occur in the future as threat multipliers, where challenges we already face, challenges with poverty or lack of infrastructure, challenges with severe weather events, are made more complicated, more difficult, or more unusual or extended to new places. And understanding that the threat multiplier face of climate is what we really need to deal with is going to be really important for the future. What I'd like to do is say just a couple of things about the nature of climate risks in the future, and then turn to the solution space. Dr. Pachauri mentioned that a lot of the risks come in the area of extremes. I want to mention several that we're already seeing clear indication of trends in. The first is extremes in high temperatures and heat waves. No question, we've seen worldwide increase. A second area is one that we saw played out in Buffalo just in the last couple of days, and that's an increase in the extremes of heavy precipitation, and dramatic change, especially in the United States, in the fraction of precipitation that falls in the heaviest precipitation events. And the physics of this are really well understood. A warmer atmosphere can just hold a lot more water, and that the more water you got in the atmosphere, the more can come out in extreme events. And in a setting like Buffalo, that's amplified by the fact that there's a huge body of water that's been warmed as a result of the warming climate that's pumping moisture into the atmosphere. A third set of extremes are those that are associated with rising sea levels, and we've already seen a globally average sea level rise of about 8 inches. That doesn't sound like much. You've got to remember that damages from high sea level are typically associated with high tides or storm surge that's piled on top of whatever the level is. And damage from rising sea levels are very much a kind of a threshold event. If a wave is below the top of the levee, it doesn't make any difference. If it's over the top of the seawall or the levee, all of a sudden your subway system is full of water. And I think in Hurricane Sandy, again, we saw evidence of the systems being overwhelmed by extremes. And then another category of events that Dr. Pachauri didn't speak about that it's important to understand is what in the scientific world we call large-scale singular events, and that's like the things that once put in place can't be reversed and have genuinely earth-altering consequences. The one that's the biggest concern in the scientific community now is commitment to loss of a major continental ice sheet. The Greenland ice sheet has a sea level equivalent of between 20 and 25 feet. We know if we're committed to the loss of the Greenland ice sheet, we will see globally average sea level rises of 20 to 25 feet over some centuries, but the issue is that the science says we're close to commitment to loss of a major ice sheet. In fact, some of you may have seen news articles just in the last couple of months that talk about a number of scientific papers that say we may be committed already to loss of the West Antarctic ice sheet, which has a sea level equivalent that's only about 16 feet. The estimates are that the temperature required for commitment to loss of the Greenland ice sheet is somewhere between 1.5 and 4 centigrade, about 3 and 7 degrees Fahrenheit, and we've already seen a warming of about 1.5 centigrade. So we don't know where that threshold is, and when we think about climate as a challenge in managing risks, there's a tremendous value in applying a precautionary principle, not getting any closer to that threshold than we need to get. As I leave the topic of risk from a changing climate, I want to just reiterate a point that Dr. Pachauri made. If we look at a world of the future, a world of ambitious mitigation where we might in this century limit warming to something like 3 to 4 Fahrenheit, we'll see a world with profound impacts. But it's a world where the impacts can almost all be managed with aggressive investments in adaptation, coping as effectively as we can with the climate changes that can't be avoided. In a world with continued high emissions, where we end the century at temperatures that are something like 7 to 10 above pre-industrial levels, that's a world where, we can talk about the impacts that the models project, but that's a world that's so different than the present and so different from any kind of world where we have historical experience that it's really difficult to project what the impacts will be. I think of that as a world where all bets are off, and especially all bets are off because it's a world where the kinds of interactions between different systems that are impacted by climate change are so multidimensional and so difficult to project. But let me turn to just some closing thoughts on the solution space. I talked about whether or not there really is a dichotomy between investing in a future, investing in people through ambitious economic growth versus ambitious attention to climate. And what I think is the most encouraging feature of the new Ipcc assessments is profound evidence of co-benefits from investing now in adaptation and investing now in mitigation, with investments that can yield both short-term benefits in economic activity, in sustainability of the global economy, and in fairness of the global economy, at the same time that these investments are building a more robust future and a resilient future that can protect us from the worst impacts of climate change. So in a very large sense, the economic questions about climate change aren't questions of whether we're poorer or richer in the future if we do invest in the solutions. It's whether we have an economy that favors innovators, that favors the opportunity to invest in novel, safe solutions, or whether we have an economy that continues to invest in energy systems that we know to be non-sustainable and where the benefits of those investments accrue to a small number of people. At least for me, there's no question about which way we should go in the future, but I think that the conversation needs to be understood to be not one about whether or not future societies are going to have robust economies and vibrant communities, but whether we're going to do that in an ambitious short-term way or whether we're going to wait and just let the tides of inertia wash over us. Thanks very much. I'd be happy to take any questions. Sure. Happy to take any questions. How much time do we have?
15 minutes, 20 minutes.
Great.
Okay. My name is Ken Weir from the University of San Francisco. Lima aside, how optimistic are you about the meeting in Paris?
Okay. Do you want me to take a bunch of questions, or should I do them one at a time? Okay. It's a great question, and if you want to solve a big problem, it's actually hard to think of an environment for problem solving that's more complicated or difficult than the UN framework conventions on anything. And so I'm optimistic that we are looking at a future where we're approaching a widespread understanding that addressing the climate challenge in a way that that makes a real difference is something that great nations do. I think that we saw indications that that's getting to be a pervasive narrative in the recent deal between the U.S. and China. I think eventually the elements of climate change that make it a common action problem are going to require participation by countries around the world. But to be honest, the dynamics of the UN framework conventions make it more difficult rather than easier to see good solutions move forward. So I would say I am guardedly optimistic that we'll see meaningful progress, but I think that the real progress on climate is coming from things like California's Global Warming Solutions Act, the deal between the U.S. and China, and importantly, the International Green Climate Fund.
Susan Thistlethwaite, I'm a theologian, teach at Chicago Theological Seminary. I want to ask you about a terminology change. We are getting killed in the court of public opinion. I mean, we just had a survey on that. And there will be no action unless the general public supports changed policy. I think global warming has been terrible terminology. I think climate change is mildly better. I have favored Hunter Levin's global weirding. He's an environmentalist from Colorado, but I don't think that's good enough. What do you think would happen if climate scientists, as a group, said, it has reached a point where we are going to change the terminology and we will only speak of climate crisis from here on out? But I think some dramatic reframing of the debate, given the science that is available, while there is not, predictability in a chaotic system like this. But what do you think about simply deciding, as a group, we will no longer use the terminology climate change, we will call it climate crisis or other alarmist language of your choice?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I can only think of one group that's harder to corral into doing things all the same way than the UN Framework Convention with all the countries, and that's the scientific community. So, independent of what I think, that's not going to be determinative. I agree that the language is really important, and I agree that both climate change and global warming have not been as widely understood as they need to be, and in particular, people haven't understood the link with extremes. I think that one of the goals that we have in the Ipcc is to try and maintain the opportunity to have good conversations with all of the stakeholders. And when you look at Ipcc reports, you could legitimately say, wow, they really understated that. They missed an opportunity to emphasize how critically important this challenge is. And part of that reflects the fact that we need to get the governments to buy in. Every word in an Ipcc summary for policymakers is approved by consensus by every government. So that's one reason that the statements tend to be guarded. But a second is this really important dimension of having a conversation that we can carry forward with business leaders, with governments around the world. And I like the idea of striving for a more descriptive term, and possibly something like climate disruption would capture the elements of the material that the science is based on, without necessarily saying that it is a crisis, even though I personally believe that it is.
Thank you.
I appreciate your comments today. Thank you for coming and speaking at this conference. My question is about geoengineering. A number of the remarks you made were oriented around the conceptualization of risk and the way that scientists communicate information about risk to public constituencies. The Ipcc framework requires very careful boundaries for the development of scientific research that don't include any place for research on geoengineering. I understand that a number of different professional organizations are sort of dropping their moratoriums on geoengineering research, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in general about that rapidly changing area of climate science. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and just to provide a little background to people who may not even know what geoengineering is, people often talk about whether there are technologies we could use to kind of cover up the fact that climate change is occurring, to counter it not by cutting emissions of heat-trapping gases to the atmosphere, but by doing something else, basically releasing another kind of pollution to the atmosphere that reflects sunlight back into space. There's kind of broad sense and narrow sense geoengineering. In some ways you could say, well, for the last several hundred years we've been dramatically altering the composition of the atmosphere by releasing all these heat-trapping gases. Isn't that geoengineering? Or we now have human activities that dominate the world's ecosystems. Isn't that geoengineering? And it really is. But in general, when people talk about solutions, they talk about two kinds of technologies. Some technologies are called carbon dioxide removal, and that can be anything from fertilizing the oceans to growing more forest. And some are solar radiation management, and it's polluting the atmosphere in order to reflect radiation back into space. Those two sets of technologies are very different. Many of the technologies that Dr. Pachauri talked about for getting emissions down to zero and eventually below zero involve carbon dioxide removal and sequestration in geological reservoirs. And we do know a lot about carbon dioxide removal, and even though there's a lot to learn, it looks like a set of technologies that will be safe and economical and very low risk. The other set of technologies is solar radiation management technology. Think of kind of papering over the climate problem. They paper it over in the sense that the CO2 is still there, it's still acidifying the oceans, and if you stop releasing these pollutants to the atmosphere, the temperatures pop up at an unbelievably rapid rate. It could be several degrees per year of temperature increase if you ever stopped geoengineering with solar radiation management. But the fact of the matter is, we haven't been making very much progress in solving the climate problem. I started out with the evidence that the increase in atmospheric CO2 last year was the highest we've ever seen. We also know very little about the prospects and the risks of geoengineering through solar radiation management. So it seems responsible to me that we should know more about it, that understanding whether or not this is a set of technologies and in any way might be relevant, might be cost effective, is worth doing. My personal feeling is the more we learn, the less attractive those technologies are going to look. But I can't think of a scientist as a reason that we wouldn't want to know more about the possibilities.
First of all, thank you so much for the work that you're doing and for your presentation today. My name is Ruth Brody-Sharon. I'm the co-chair of the Southern California Parliament of the World's Religions, and I'm also here as a correspondent for the Interfaith Observer, an online magazine. I recently was in New York for a conference that was put on by the Union Theological Seminary under the leadership of Karenna Gore, Al Gore's daughter. It was called Religions for the Earth. And one of the main themes, of course, was the idea of this sacred responsibility, that it's not just a good idea because of what's happening in the world, but linking it to holy duty to guarantee that there will be a world to continue. And then right after that, I participated in the People's Climate March, which had 400,000 people, and I interviewed people, and I asked them why they were there, and I asked whether they thought it would make a difference to the governments who were making decisions. And one young woman said to me, it doesn't matter. What matters is that we were here and we know we have to do something about it. So now I'm coming to my question. That was just the backdrop. Is there any, we know that the secular movement began the ecological charge, but it didn't really get teeth until the different religions decided to tell their congregations, pastors, rabbis, imams, and so forth. How can, I'm not a scholar, and I'm in the trenches. I'm asking, how can this august organization, AAR, which has so many people on its roster, is there some way to galvanize through the idea of sacred responsibility to get more people interested in becoming part of this movement? It's growing, but it seems to me that you've laid out a very serious timeline here. And I'm just wondering, not thinking along the lines of from science and what science is explaining, but how can we actually use what already exists as a platform to get more people on board?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I can't speak with any great authority to the opportunities for the AAR or for any other specific body, but I can say that my personal experience is that the solutions to the climate challenge are going to come from having there be millions of conversations and not just one or two conversations. I think the challenge we faced in the past is that people have said, hey, scientists, tell us what the solutions are. And we can tell you what the science is, but the solutions involve conversations around family dinner tables, they involve conversations in the streets of New York City, and they involve conversations in corporate boardrooms and in parliaments around the world. And I think that recognizing that the solution is about the millions of conversations rather than the one or two is probably the most important step moving forward.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your work. I have a question about the U.S.-China climate change agreement. And I was rather disappointed by the New York Times discussion of this. Basically, they focused on China and saying, oh, China's not going to really be able to implement it, blah, blah, blah. And they didn't say anything about the United States. However, I'm a China scholar. I actually think there's a better chance that the Chinese side will be able to live up to it because one thing, they have absolutely atrociously despoiled their, all their natural environment, and they are actually much more concerned about it because they're experiencing it much more palpably. The United States, on the other hand, you have both houses of Congress, Republican, they are not going to allow Obama really to do anything with this. So what is your assessment about the two countries and maybe you can just say a little bit about the background of this agreement and how you think it can really be implemented and realized?
Sure. Well, let me say first of all that it's clear that the commitments that the U.S. and China made are not sufficient to solve the problem, but it also is really clear that on the international stage, a huge disincentive to active participation has been recognition that the U.S., which is historically the largest emitter, wasn't really doing anything, and the discussion in the U.S. has been really tangled up in the idea that, well, China is currently the largest emitter, it isn't really doing anything. And I think the fact that those two actors have now decided to move together is really, really important. I hope it can be catalytic on the international stage. Let me say just a couple of, I can't speak to the issue of the politics of whether it's more likely to be implemented in China or the US, but I would like to say one thing about the magnitude of the lift that the two countries have undertaken. My impression was a lot of the press coverage said, oh, geez, the Chinese aren't really doing all that much, and it's a big change in the U.S. But I think that's actually exactly wrong. If you look at the recent trajectory of emissions growth in China, over the last decade, year-on-year emissions have grown about 7% per year in China. It's hugely important for the global climate. It's hugely important for the global economy, too. But what that means is that for China to get down to level emissions and decreasing emissions by 2030 means that they need to shave 0.4% per year off of their year-on-year annual change. That's a big deal. In the U.S., over the last 10 years, our emissions have gone down year-on-year by about 1% per year. And in order for us to hit the target that was announced, minus 28% by 2025, we'll need to decrease emissions an additional, it's about 0.12% per year, less than a third of the lift that China will need to take. So I think that it's important to recognize that the commitment that China made is a really meaningful one, and it really will require ambitious investments across the country and commitment from the government. But the U.S. one will as well. And my understanding is that the Obama administration is confident that they have the executive authority to implement the necessary changes, but it's a complicated world, and we'll have to see how it plays out.
Does it still need to be ratified by both houses of Congress?
Supposedly not. When the announcement was made, the president was really clear that he had the authority to make the necessary changes through essentially rulemaking, like the recent EPA rules on emissions from coal-fired power plants.
Thank you.
So thank you for the work you do. I come from that kind of perspective of understanding the science you've presented as the most conservative presentation of the story one can get, pretty much, because of the kinds of agreement that you all have to, like every word by every country, so that there is a whole world. One of the things, it's great to hear the clarity and seriousness of the picture you present, but that if one understands that that's a very conservative picture, so that there is also a picture that would jumpstart, I think, some awareness, like that the year 2030 could be a very bad year, not just the year 2100. Is there, I suppose you have no room for that, but it seems important for us to understand that by the time you've said this, it is at that conservative level, and that what we need to know is that the year 2030 could be a very rough time for us, like that spectrum.
That's a really great question, and let me emphasize that the guarded language that we need to use in the IPCC doesn't mean that it's inaccurate. I think that in the IPCC you get the most balanced possible picture of what we know and what we don't know. It is a feature of the way that climate research has been done that a lot more emphasis has been put on most likely outcomes than on these low probability, high consequence, everything goes wrong at once type of outcomes. And the fact of the matter is we don't know very much about those. If you look at the most recent IPCC reports, the one that was, well, all the ones that were released over the last year and a half, what you see is that this new emphasis on understanding climate change as a challenge and managing risk really does reposition the dialogue to address the full range of possible outcomes. And I think that where there are opportunities to be more emphatic is really in the communication side, not in the information content side. But there are opportunities, and I think that part of the reason we need 1 million climate communications and not just 1 or 2 is that the language that different stakeholders understand is going to be different. And I would not pretend that the IPCC is the best communicator to all of the possible audiences.
Take a final question.
Okay, one more question.
I've been teaching environmental studies and environmental ethics for 25 years. I've been giving my students these reports ever since they started to come out. And they're very cautious in their tone for the reasons you've articulated, and yet they get more and more alarmist all along. And I very much appreciate you saying that we need to have lots of new discussions in all sorts of different sectors. As people who study religion, we realize that there's many cultural barriers to those kinds of discussions. If we study history, we realize there's lots of fraught histories that make those conversations difficult. In the sustainability sectors I run in Europe and elsewhere, I've had the temerity to suggest that we need to have far fewer human beings on the earth and our domesticated animals, those we eat and those that we enjoy as companion animals. And such statements are generally met with tone deafness or outrage. And a lot of the prescriptions that we offer are technological, geoengineering, or they focus on the energy system, but not on some of the deeper cultural issues that prevent us from wrestling with some of the drivers that the summary report that was just issued does acknowledge. And I wonder if you see possibilities that we can have a more robust and complex conversation about all the variables that are contributing not just to CO2 in the atmosphere, but also to methane, for example, which is brought forward by the way we do animal agriculture, just for one example.
I mean, certainly the answer is yes. We do need to have conversations about the full range of interacting factors. When Bill McKibben wrote about the most recent IPCC report, he said, wow, they must have really had to go to a thesaurus for this because we characterize the risks of climate change as severe, pervasive, and irreversible. And it's hard to think of language that's any stronger that you could get through the government approval process. But let me just say one thing about the population issue. There are a whole bunch of studies that show now that if you want the maximum possible return you can get on your dollars invested in limiting future climate change, meeting the current demand for family planning services is the cheapest thing you can do.
No, that's right.
So there's no question that the discussion needs to have all those additional dimensions and not just the technology ones.
An FAO official, just to add, said that on this particular point, that it would take the amount Americans spend on Thanksgiving, on Halloween every year, to provide procreative education and technologies for every woman on Earth, just to piggyback on your point. Trump change.
Thank you.
I want to thank Dr. Field and Dr. Pachauri for an extraordinary view of what really faces us. It's an extraordinary thing they're doing. They've devoted their lives to this, and we should be extraordinarily grateful that both in the middle of the night in India and here flying down from Stanford, we've been able to learn firsthand what you're working with and what you see as the world. In answer to the last question, we're having a conversation that begins today and continues all for the next several days. Dr. Bill McKibben is here to bring our next session in. There are people here who've spent their careers and their lives having exactly this kind of discussion, and this is their moment, this is their weekend. So I hope you come to the other plenary sessions. I hope you attend all the wonderful papers that are continuing, and you'll see the conversation has been extended throughout the American Academy of Religion. We're doing our very best. We're trying to respond to the challenge that our science colleagues has given us, and we're trying to do it with the most serious and sober intent. So thank you very much. Thanks, and thanks to all of you.